all of you to our final panel, Global Left on Global War, Ideologies, Solidarities, and Activism. Thank you so much for coming and especially staying until this very last panel. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for bringing us all here, our wonderful panelists for coming from so far away, and of course the Ukrainian Armed Forces for making this panel possible and this whole conference possible. So the organizers asked me to prepare a little keynote, and I will use this opportunity to sketch some questions, problems, conundrums that I see, and hopefully will prompt a discussion. So we all know the global left movement for its support and solidarity with different marginalized, oppressed, colonized people by imperial powers. The common principles that unite the left are their anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, the fight for the rights of excluded, working class people, indigenous people, LGBTQ plus people, and many others. Still, many oppressed societies around the world remain deeply disappointed that the very force that is supposed to show solidarity with them doesn't do so. We've seen that on the left during the war in Syria, when Syrian dictator Assad, together with the Russian dictator Putin, were bombing the peaceful cities, and the left remained silent. We also saw that in 2014, when the Russian President Putin occupied Crimea and invaded Donbass, and the left also, for the most part, remained silent. Today, very few leftists show sympathy when the Russian state commits crimes of genocide against Ukraine, denying Ukrainians the right for identity and self-determination and statehood. So the left remains blind to the Russian imperialism and violence, tending to blame the familiar Western foe. And someone who studied Crimea and the indigenous Crimean Tatars for years, I've seen that many times in Western academia, which is for the most part, as some of you know, is leftist, this deep misunderstanding about the nature of Russian state and its imperialism. The whole academia is structured in a way that people with connections to Russia, and these connections can be financial, emotional, intellectual, are also the same people who define the parameters of knowledge production. So what and how should we study? And also give funding to graduate students. So as a graduate student, I was told that I better not use the term annexation of Crimea if I want to get funding for my dissertation. So the academic discourse, which also forms and shapes the leftist discourse in general, refuses to see Russian imperialism both in its past and present. The studies of the Russian Empire tend to romanticize Russian autocracy. The Soviet Union is seen as a participatory project in which all nations took part voluntarily. And the current Russian Federation is seen as just an unfortunate slip into authoritarianism from the very promising democratic transformations in the 90s. However, if we look at the history of Crimea, it becomes clear that the whole history of existence of Russia is a story of imperial conquest and colonialism. Crimean Tatars know this better than anyone. In 1783, they were colonized, their state was destroyed, and by the end of the next century, more than half of the population was forced to immigrate and was substituted by the Russian settlers. The Soviet Empire in the 20th century, again, destroyed the newly created Crimean Tatar state, colonized the peninsula, deported the entire population this time, and resettled Russians, and completely Russified the peninsula. And the same thing happened in 2014. The Russian Empire violently occupied Crimea, imposed everything Russian laws, Russian culture, resettled Russians again, and today commits daily acts of oppression against the remaining Crimean Tatars. So we witness in Crimea the same policies of the Russian state throughout the history of the Russian rule there. And when we hear politicians, journalists, or academics saying that, while Crimea has always been Russian, or many Crimeans supported the referendum, this is because they disregard the history of Russian settler colonialism and do not see Russia as an empire. And I brought up this example of Crimea as a relevant example of some of the misunderstandings and paradoxes that dominate leftist thought and politics. Being anti-imperialist on the one hand, at the same time being blind to Russian imperialism. So now I would like to turn to our panelists. We have speakers from Syria, from Iran, from India, from Chile, from Ukraine, and I would like them to talk a little bit about their experiences with the left in their national context and how this influenced their struggle. I'd like to start with our first panelist, Kavita Krishnan. Kavita is an Indian feminist and women's rights activist. Until 2023, she was a member of the Communist Party of India Liberation and the secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association. In 2020, she published a book, Fearless Freedom, about the rights and safety of women in India. She was recognized as one of the BBC's 100 Women in 2014. Kavita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
It's working, right? First, I'd like to just say how thankful I am the minute I received the mail from the Office of the Crimea Platform and other civil society organizers asking if I could come. I was so grateful for the opportunity. And the introduction to who I am just described, and I think it's a little surreal probably for people in Ukraine to hear, okay, this woman was in a communist party for 30 years? What was she doing there? And I don't blame you. But I do want to begin by explaining, we are talking about the left's blind spots. So why are we talking about the left? What is the left? And what are these blind spots? Why are they there? So I just want to quickly say that there's a lot that has been written and said, and probably other panelists will speak about it, about how the better known names on the Western left and so on have responded to the war on Ukraine and their general sort of affinity for Russia, for China, and so on. And I know, these are basically individuals, intellectuals, or, who are primarily writing books or are on social media, and several of them now are doing nothing but propaganda for some authoritarians. But I'm not going to be speaking about them. I am going to be speaking about the left in my country. And I'm going to be asking you, as I have asked them and other people in India who are fighting for democracy, I'm going to appeal to you to, I think, try and hold contradictions at one time in our minds, resist the impulse to decide that my story, in which I've assumed who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, all reality has to be fitted to that story, which I have, which had a basis. But that basis I'm going to cling on to now, and I will fight any reality that comes in the way of that story. So I'm going to ask that we try to collectively, because we are people committed to justice, we are trying to work out how to build better solidarity for Ukraine in the global south. So we are going to be talking about, why are we talking about the left? Because when we think about the problems with building solidarity in the global south, it isn't the left that's standing in the way of building that solidarity, but we are talking about it because we want the left. We hoped that the left could be of help in breaking down prejudices and building that solidarity. And we feel let down because the left is not doing that. Whereas it has done it, taken up other unpopular causes in other circumstances. So it's not doing it now. So even though the left is a minority in many of the countries we are talking about, it's of the global south, and they are themselves victimized, but we do want from them better standards, and we want them to do this labor, which they are not. So why is it, where do these blind spots come from? And I would argue that the blind spots in my part of the world are not blind spots that are specific to the left alone. The precise reason why they are so persistent and why any attempt to disturb them is greeted with almost incomprehension is because it is so widely shared by, for instance, in India. Most Indians know the Soviet Union. I was brought up in a steel plant township, where the plant was set up with Soviet collaboration. My father was sent to Kiev to train. But we understood the Soviet Union, the Hindi word for Soviet Union, the most commonly used if you're not a commentator on television and being very careful, is Soviet Russia, Soviet Rus. Soviet Union, no one says that. So it's commonly, just anyone randomly off the street barely knows where Ukraine is. The ones who do would be students now, going to study here and so on, who do know. The point is, in general popular understanding, that is not there. Plus, of course, because they get so much of their history about this part of the world from the Soviet Union, you can imagine that Ukraine did not figure very much there, and I can say that for myself. So this larger blind spot that we are talking about, where does that come from and how do we fight it? Because frankly, in India as well as here, I have given up the project of only trying to address the left. Because when I say left, when I say left now, in the rest of my talk, I'm not going to be talking only about declared communists or Marxists or socialists. I'm not. I'm going to be, when I say left, I'm going to be talking about people who recognize far-right ideologies as a threat to democracy and who defend democracy, who are not just sitting somewhere writing something, but they're really invested in a more democratic and more just world. I'm going to use the word left in that sense. And that, I believe, I'm addressing you here, because you don't have to be a leftist or an anti-capitalist or whatever. I'm just assuming you believe justice is a good thing. Freedom and democracy are good things, and that we, of so many languages and so many countries, when we say freedom, when we say democracy, we kind of mean, we understand each other, we know what that means in general. The authoritarians that we are talking about, Putin, Xi Jinping, Modi, many others. My argument to my own friends in India and to everybody fighting for democracy in India and anywhere else has been that it's not just that these forces are collaborating with each other. Iran, so many forces. They are insisting, they are saying one thing in common. They are saying that the very idea that we understand each other when we say democracy, that's a lie. Those of us who think we understand each other, we are just Western agents. We are the dupes of the West or the agents of the West. And so those of Western elites, they say, oh, the Western public, that's with us. It's only if you believe in that democracy means broadly the same thing, that is universal or globally understood principles of democracy, you are just basically an imperialist apologist or a dupe. And what is their primary example of this? I say this as a feminist. The number one example that Putin's speech is wartime speeches. What's he talking about? Every speech he gives you the example of imperialism. Number one example of imperialism is what he calls, the Satanist attack on family values. And so, oh my God, this is a family of two men, two women, mom and mom, dad and dad, gender is not real, you know, girls can become boys, boys can become girls. This is the Antichrist. This is Satanism. Dugin uses the word from Hindu mythology for this, for the overturning of, hierarchies. He says it's Kali Yuga. Things are upside down. So they are saying the international rule of law is a lie, the rules-based order is a Western ploy, and the West has double standards, and so there should be no standards. So those of us who are defending Ukraine, advocating for Ukraine, what is the difficulty that I face when I do that there? I have to speak to people who are very well versed in every detail of how the West has double standards. When Putin says that, they hear that. And they say, and this I can say about close friends who agree with me on Ukraine. But if Putin has just given a speech, I've had a good friend come up to me and say, but that, when he says that, it's kind of, yeah, who else says this? He has a point. The West is completely double standards. Who is the West to talk about democracy? So then I have to say, but democracy doesn't belong to Bush or Biden or Obama or Trump or anyone, right? Democracy is something people have fought for. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not just something that, the post-World War powers sat and decided. Sure, they had power then but they also did it because there was a large demand for it, there was a moral moment for it, and people really felt that we have to assert at this time that human beings are just born with rights. If I'm a gay person, I don't need the state to recognize me. The state may criminalize me, but I'm human, and so I have the right to be gay, right? So my problem is how to build solidarity, and I feel that the only way to build solidarity for Ukraine is to, the only way to build solidarity for each other, for the oppressed, and in this case for Ukraine, is to establish, embrace solidarity as a principle and to offer solidarity elsewhere. And to do that, I think the first thing is to accept that contradictions exist. The story we may believe may be partly true, but it may not be the whole truth. For instance, let me give you an example of something I learned here in this session. I heard speakers here from Venezuela, Nicaragua, and in the stories I believed and I held quite close, I knew that in Latin America, America has had a very bad role. America has believed in manifest destiny and has gone around meddling, has toppled governments, backed, for instance, the Contras in Nicaragua. I know all about those. But now I see that, all right, the guys the Contras were killing were also, not good guys. So I reassess in my head the story I know about who is the good guy, who is the bad guy, right? So I ask people in my part of the world to do that, to say, you think Russia's been good to you. They were good to you for their own reasons at that time. Today they are Modi's best pal, and he is behaving like that. So do not think that he really has your well-being at heart, right? So what I feel is that in order to, and here I will build on the previous session as well, because I found that very illuminating. Because our session is, after all, about the, we are here with a focus on Crimea. So I feel that if it's about blind spots, and then I think the reason for that is the history of colonialisms and imperialisms. And the victims of one colonialism, ironically, our view of the world is shaped by that same colonial power. They're the ones who tell us what story we accept. And likewise, the victims of another colonialism or imperialism, their story is shaped by their colonialists. So India was colonized by the British. So India says the Brits are bad, the Americans are bad. Whoever the Brits and Americans must be supporting, namely Ukraine, must be bad. They're on their side. So you look at it from a camp angle. The left does exactly the same thing. But in India, the left is not the main party doing this. across the board, the far right, of course, but even other, like broadly, this is the consensus, this is the common sense. And so, likewise, I find that those who have experienced Soviet imperialism, they say, oh, you know, if the West is saying, with the Muslim world, oh, these LGBT rights and feminism must be all wrong because the West, we hear the West talking about it. So if you are a Muslim woman talking about this, you must be, you know, you're just become Western. You are not true to your values. And likewise. So I think the way to break through that and the way to build solidarity, and as someone on the left broadly, not quite sure what that means now for me, but I do, you know, in a broad sense, understand myself as a fighter for democracy, for justice. I think that the way past those blind spots, the way to dissolve those blind spots, is to recognize, how do we unite? They're dividing us. They're dividing us all the time. They divided us when they carved up the world. And today they're dividing us by saying, if you are in this camp, then you have to look at the world this way. So how do we look at the world as people, separate from how governments look at it and separate from how geopolitics looks at it? Politics is about justice. It is about people. And that's why the left falls for these realist, very right-wing ideas about geopolitics, which means this is something removed from politics. It's about some war between the big powers. So what? Why should we care? We should care to stand with the victims and the oppressed and those fighting for justice, no matter who is the oppressor, no matter what the political identity or other religious identity or whatever of the oppressor is. How do we do that? My suggestion would be, I'm close to the last, right? I know. So my suggestion would be that our baseline be, we may differ on many, many things. We may not yet share the same story, all right? We may have very different stories about different conflicts in the world. But I think the baseline has to be that we defend and demand that any power embrace the international rules-based order, the international rule of law. We will fight double standards, of course. You know, so if some Western country is talking about those standards and they're violating them, we are going to say you're violating them and we are going to resist you. All the examples you've cited there about invasions, imperialist actions in other parts of the world. But we will have to do it no matter who does it. So I would say here that I express, I'm going to point out something, an observation, and just ask you to think about it. We've been here for, since the 13th. The only session, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in which we heard mention of an enormous human rights, humanitarian crisis and, potential ethnic cleansing and genocide happening right now, threatening civilians exactly as Ukrainians are threatened, cutting off food, shelter, water, cutting off food, electricity, water, saying the entire nation is evil, and so, all of that. Those statements are being made now. The only mention we heard of it was on a panel about Muslims. That's not a Muslim issue. Ukraine should not be an issue for Eastern Europe. It shouldn't be an issue for, post-Soviet countries. It's an issue for justice. And for those of us in the world who maybe never knew about this, we have to put in the labor of solidarity to know more. And until we know more, maybe we won't accept all of Ukraine's story, but we have to stand with Ukraine based on, international principles of democracy, rule of law, autonomy, sovereignty. So I will just end here by making a suggestion, a very gentle suggestion. I know that probably many of you will not entirely agree right now. But taking off from the last session and this one, I would say that one of the things which would make a huge difference in my country for sure, and in persuading the oppressed in my country, the Muslim minority which is oppressed by Hindu majoritarianism, to support Ukraine, to remove one blind spot, a little bit, to blur the blind spot, would be if we could have a statement of solidarity condemning attacks on civilians, condemning, of course, the Hamas is a terrorist group, condemning its atrocity. But terrorism should not be committed by a state either. So attacks on civilians is wrong. The United Nations, we should just say what the United Nations is saying. That's a bare minimum, which is that if you tell 1 million people to evacuate from Gaza, that's a mass population transfer. People in this part of the world, in Eastern Europe, know what a mass population transfer is. Stalin did it, big time. It's been done with the Tatars over and over. So, and they're saying that cutting off food, electricity, water, exactly what the UN said about doing it in Ukraine, they're saying it about doing it in Gaza, that this is collective punishment. It's a polite word for ethnic cleansing, it's a polite word for genocide. But collective punishment, you're going to punish an entire people for a real or imagined crime committed by one party. I know that Ukraine has committed no crime, I hear a lot, but then Hamas. But the people are not Hamas. There is a difference between civilians. So I would just end by saying that consistency is the only way, only road I have to offer to get, to remove my own blind spots. And I think that's the way ahead for us all. And so my talk isn't so much about, it's a labor we all need to do, whether we call ourselves left or not.
Thank you so much, Kavita. Yes, I completely agree that if we are expecting as Ukrainians solidarity from the rest of the world, then we also should extend our hands and show solidarity to others. And also thank you for kind of bringing out this, all these different contradictions that we should all keep in mind when we are expecting, when we see something as black and white, so clear for us, there is such a moral clarity about the war in Ukraine, but we also should keep in mind about the so many contradictions that are in elsewhere, yes. So our next speaker is Oleksiy Harань. Oleksiy is a professor of comparative politics at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. Since 2015, he has served as a research director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, which is a leading Ukrainian analytical and sociological think tank. He has started a joint project in the Global South, and already as part of the Ukrainian civil society delegation, Professor Harань already visited 11 countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. He co-edited, in particular, the book Ukrainian Left, Between Leninism and Social Democracy. Pane Oleksiyu, please.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Namaste. Salam alaikum. Salamat. Dina. Salamat. Buenas tardes. Jumbo. Anybody knows what jumbo is? Nobody speaks Swahili here. Okay, Bwanji. Bwanji is hello in Nyanja language from Zambia. And this morning, I've come back to Ukraine from a trip to Zambia and South Africa, which was organized by Swedes. And I would like to stress it, because you know that some events which are conducted by representatives of the US, UK, France, they're viewed with suspicion in the so-called Global South. All were colonizers or supported colonialism. While it's not the case for Scandinavia, and Scandinavia was always against apartheid and colonialism. So Scandinavians are more trusted in this part of the world. So we should take it into account, as well as some other countries, and I will talk about this later. But first of all, let me start with my personal story. And those who know me, they know that I love personal stories to tell to others. So I was a student of international relations in Kyiv in 70s. And remember what a wonderful time were 70s for liberation movement and struggle. 1975, collapse of Portuguese empire and new countries in South Africa. 1979, revolution in Nicaragua. Cubans are sending soldiers to Africa. Number of people's republics in Africa. Anybody knows about people's republics in Africa? Raise your hands. Who knows about it? Who remembers about it? 2 people. Benin, Congo, Angola, Mozambique, people's republics. Ethiopia was officially called Socialist Ethiopia. Officially. So it looked like, you know, the world revolution is really going on. And I was dreaming about the world revolution, how I will be kind of Che Guevara. I made a t-shirt with Che Guevara myself, because at that time you couldn't find Che Guevara shirts in the Soviet Union. No, in the Soviet Union they didn't like Che Guevara. So I was dreaming about it, and I remember how we were happy about this anti-colonial struggle and the fight for democracy. And basically what I am trying to explain to people in these countries right now, that we were in solidarity with you. Please be in solidarity with us when we are holding anti-colonial struggle and the fight of democracy against dictatorship. Oh, I have forgotten to greet everybody left in this room. Are there any left in this room? Great. 2, 3. Okay. I would like to greet right in this room. Are there anybody right? No. 1. Good, good. Thank you for your bravery. Are there any centrists in this room? Guys, what about others? You do not have any ideology. Okay. As Marx said, there is a hidden ideology in everything. Okay, but anyway, what I would like to stress is being left definitely doesn't contradict our struggle, Ukrainian struggle, vice versa. The left should logically support those who are fighting against colonialism, imperialism, dictatorship, and oligarchs. This is very natural for the left. And I always would like to remind my left colleagues about what was the pretext for the creation of the first international. Does anybody know about that? A plus. A plus. Any other remember about it? Do you know about it? Do you know about it? Yeah, that's true. Yes. Oh, you know, A plus. A plus. Yeah. So I would like to enroll you in my course. You will have an excellent marks. Okay, because. Yeah. You know about that? Oh, great. Look, because when I talk to social democrats, to laborers from the UK, they don't know about it. But we studied Marxism very well, right? Okay, so we know about it, and I believe that's a good point. So that Marx actually, and people around him, they supported Poles in their fight against Russian Tsarism. Now, if we talk about Lenin, that's important to remember again, that Lenin differentiated between 2 kinds of nationalism. And he said, the nationalism of those who is oppressing others is definitely bad. So for him, the Russian chauvinism was the main enemy. And he was very, very clear about it. And maybe this is explanation why Mr. Putin doesn't like Lenin. But when Lenin talked about nationalism of those oppressed, he said, well, it could be both progressive and reactionary, but it could be progressive. And definitely this was better to Lenin than the chauvinism of those who were oppressors. So I think that actually we can refer to Marx and to Lenin as well. Now about one of the main topics for the left, because left are talking about NATO expansion, that this is the cause of the war. So again, we need to remind to them that when Ukraine was attacked in 2014, it was a neutral country. Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO. And by the way, I have realized how many people are talking about NATO expansion and do not understand why it happened. They thought it happened because of NATO. No. It happened because of those small countries who were part of communist empire or Russian empire because they wanted to secure their security. They wanted NATO to be expanded. So that's why I believe it's very important, you know, when we have the voices of these countries. And when I was in South Africa this time, there was a very interesting conference conducted actually by Poles and Lithuanians about their experience to live in the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union. So I think from practical point of view, it's very important that we are conducting joint events with these countries who experienced what the Russian system or communist system was. Now, about the Soviet Union. Definitely the Soviet Union, as it is what's said here, you know, it had a kind of positive flavor to most of these countries. So it's really, you know, tricky point, because when I was telling to the people, Putin would like to restore the Soviet Empire, I saw in the eyes that students do not understand it, because Soviet Union for them is a positive thing. So it's better to talk about Russian Empire. And by the way, the difference between Russian Empire and other empires, what is the basic difference between Russian Empire and British Empire or French or whatever? Because there was never democracy in the Russian Empire or Soviet Union. Gandhi or Mandela or Sukarno, they wouldn't survive. Very, very simple in this country. So they couldn't have their non-violent movement because they would be immediately crushed and sentenced to death. So we need to remind people in a cautious way that the Soviet Union was empire in itself, and the Soviet Union committed huge crimes in the developing world. And again, I remember in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, there is a museum right in the center of the capital. And the museum is devoted to victims of Red Terror. And do you know where the term comes from, Red Terror? From Soviet Russia, from Lenin. And it's awful museum with all the skulls, and so it's really awful. And in the same way, you know, so the Soviet Union, when he imposed his model on Ethiopia, there were huge crimes and there was collectivization. And we know very well that collectivization means starvation, right? And still there are people in these countries, including Ethiopia, which are very anti-Western. So, including those who receive grants from the West, human rights defenders. So it means that it's difficult. It's really difficult to work in these countries, but at the same time we need to present hard facts to these people. And we need to remind that Russia is not equal to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is not equal to Russia. Actually, it was Ukraine in the Soviet times which was a member of UN Special Committee against apartheid. Ukraine, not Soviet Union. Okay, this was a trick of Soviet diplomacy, definitely. But from the formal point of view, it was Ukraine, which co-sponsored lots of resolutions, and it was our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Udavenka, who at some point was head of this committee. So many delegates from Africa and Asia, they embraced him in the halls of the United Nations, because it was Ukraine which co-authored many resolutions against apartheid and colonialism. I would end with importance of Ukrainian left, real Ukrainian left, to speak to these countries. And again, we know what the Communist Party of Ukraine was. Communist Party of Ukraine supported dictatorship, and Communist Party of Ukraine, unfortunately, supported Russia. So they lost tremendously in elections of 2014. And then it's important to remember what is banned in Ukraine. It's not ideology of communism, because we can't ban the ideology, right? It was the propaganda of the symbols of totalitarian states, both Nazi and the system which existed in the Soviet Union. So it's not ideology. Again, we cannot ban ideology. And we have now some, I would say, kind of progressive left who are not united in the party, but they have their own publication, which is called Commons. I do not agree with all of what have been said there, but they are very clear about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. They are denouncing Russia. So this was our old dream in Ukraine, that we need to have not just left, we need to have Ukrainian left, which are not subordinated to Moscow. And most of these people, they are associated with younger generation. Definitely they are getting older, but for me, compared to me, they are young. And I witnessed, because they conducted a seminar with left from South Africa, and it was eye-revealing for the left in South Africa. And I believe in the same way they may conduct seminars with left intellectuals or left in Latin America and other countries. I would stop here. Thank you very much. Natacha Sana, Zikomo, 2 languages of Zambia.
Thank you so much, Pane Alexiou, for your
Thank you so much, Alexei.
whole talk. So many things to unpack. Just one thing that I would like to kind of touch upon is this notion of nationalism that you mentioned, and how, interestingly, the left is so preoccupied with the Ukrainian nationalism and completely disregards Russian fascism, which is the epitome of the Russian nationalism. And maybe that's something that we can discuss later. And our next speaker is Samira Ardalani, who is a human rights activist from Iran and Italy. She is the vice president of the Giovanni Iraniani Residenti in Italia Association, which, among other things, fights the human rights violations in Iran and raises public and political awareness. Yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for having me. The left is supposed to defend the rights of the people. But how is it responding to modern challenges? I think that I would like to start with this question. Which is the major international threat today? Is the union of dictatorships? Are the non-aligned movement, the bloc basically in the UN, who is supposed not to be aligned with strong with any major power, but we have seen that is usually aligned with the Iranian regime, Russia, China. So what happens? What happens is that I am not generalizing, but a certain part of the left, specific elements, specific groups, they fall in the trap that I am talking as an Iranian activist, so I will analyze the approach, which is actually really similar, but they have towards the Iranian cause and the Iranian regime. The regime creates this perfect trap in which part of the left falls. And so we see that, for example, women's rights activists from the left, who are supposed to defend women's rights, travel to Iran, and even though they do not freely choose to wear the hijab in their daily life because they are not Muslims, they do accept to put on the mandatory veil when they visit the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the question is, what is the message that these activists, these women, are sending to Iranian women to give in, to accept oppression, not to resist? And this is one point. Another practical example. So the left is against the war, and we are all against war. But what is the solution? Is the solution appeasement? It is not. So with these talks and these arguments, the Iranian regime propaganda, and I'm going to talk about it later, actually manages to, again, make them fall in this trap so that they end up practicing a policy of appeasement towards the Iranian regime, but history has taught us, and we have all seen, we are seeing, that appeasement leads to war. So what happens is that in the end, this part of the left world ends up betraying its own values. It should be defending people's rights, but in fact is defending dictators' interests. It should defend women's rights, but in fact it is not. It is encouraging those who are violating women's rights. It should stand against war, but by appeasing these dictators, it ends up leading to wars. So we had practical examples of this in the European Parliament with what was the Qatar Gate. And I think that everybody heard about it and remembers it. We had the Qatar Gate, we had Mamedov's involvement in the Qatar Gate, and he had been actively campaigning against the Iranian resistance in the European Parliament. What we see is that there are journalists who live abroad. Some of them are of Iranian origin, some of them, they are foreigners, and we call them friend journalists, but when we say friend journalists, we mean friend of the regime, and they basically encourage, with their articles and analysis, they encourage European countries and the US and the West world to have a policy that, in fact, in the end, actually defends the regime's interests. And they're also really engaged in what we call the campaign of demonization. They try to discredit the Iranian resistance. They try to stop Iranian resistance activities abroad on the one side, and on the other side, they push for appeasement when they should not. They take stances against the blacklisting of the IRGC that we know are involved in terrorist activities, in repression, domestic repression in Iran, and we also know that they are involved in this war in Ukraine. These are many practical examples. We've seen articles in The Guardian, we've seen articles in The Spiegel, we've seen the same reality in the German parliament. This narrative, this is what I would like to underline, that we see makes them fall in this trap. And what is the consequence? The consequence is that, basically, they repeat the same lies, the same accusations, which are accusations with no basis, against the Iranian regime, the Iranian resistance in favor of the Iranian regime, and they keep spreading this propaganda. So we have this big problem of this propaganda machine that I think you understand, because you have to deal with it too. And yes, so these were a few examples. I will not go, I may talk a lot more about this, but I think what is important is to understand what the left actually is supposed to be, and and which questions those who are in the left parties should make themselves, which are the questions, which are the threats. I think they need to realize which are the actual threats, the real threats, and focus on those. Otherwise, they will fall in these traps, because these are traps made by the regime, by dictatorships, because they do know that they work. They're made for them. And they will end up supporting dictators, violating people's rights, supporting imperialism, and supporting, in the end, war by supporting appeasement.
Thank you so much, Samira, and really thank you for bringing the Iranian perspective to this question. And I really appreciate that you kind of highlighted that actually, like, it's not that the left is not supporting, they might actually support the people, it's just that their solutions are usually contradict the very interests of the people that they're trying to support. But also with this kind of the solutions for appeasement, they also contradict their own ideology, which is in fact revolutionary and militaristic. So yeah. Okay, so let's move to our next speakers. We have two speakers joining us online. So the first will be Manuel Ferres. Manuel is a PhD candidate in sociology from the Alberto Hurtado University in Santiago de Chile. Manuel is also a journalist at Oriente Media News. He recently compiled a wonderful book co-authored with Olena Palko called Ukraine's Many Faces, Land, People, and Culture Revisited. This is one of his 6 books that he has published, and we're very happy that he can join us, at least online. Manuel?
Venceremos, no pasarán.
Hello, how are you? Can you see my presentation? Let me know.
Yes.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Maria. Hi to all the other panelists. I will read my presentation to be more quickly to... you can see my presentation. I will expose to you some examples as I read my presentation. So I title my presentation, Seeking Solidarity with Ukraine in the Latin American Left. Russia's new aggression against Ukraine has aroused much interest in 4 distinct but strongly interrelated environments or levels in Latin America. Political level, as you see, my president Boric with Zelensky. Academic level, media and social level. The ignorance about Ukraine and Ukrainians was reflected in the 4 environments. Russian propaganda proved to be very effective, activating prejudice and defamations against Ukraine and Ukrainians. I would like to focus on the first 2 levels or environments, the political and the academic elite, because understanding how the conflict in Ukraine is imagined and explained in the Latin American political and academic elite allows us to explain the terrible work of the media and their opinion makers, and at the social level, the lack of empathy and solidarity with Ukrainians among the social sectors of the Latin American left. At the political level, the Russian aggression was reactivated just when Latin America has a series of governments declared to be part of the political left, and some of them belong to the global left movement. At the academic level, in which many academicians began to talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, especially worrying has been the reaction of academicians identified with the political left. I have called this situation a crisis of the political imagination of the Latin American left. This crisis is rooted in the stagnation and lack of creativity of the political thought of the modern Latin American left. To this crisis and stagnation of the political and academic imagination of the Latin American left, we must add a long-standing work and impact of Russian propaganda that managed to seduce many important voices in Latin America, taking advantage of the rabid anti-American sentiment of the Latin American political and academic elites. It's very clear that international order is being not only questioned, which is right and necessary, but attacked by several international actors who, based on a false decolonial narrative that had deceived more than one in the Latin American left, seek to impose an order in which ethnic and religious violence, submission, invasion, and even genocide and ethnic cleansing will be the ways to solve global disputes and injustice. Contemporary Russia shows all its colonialist and imperialist tendencies not only in its 9-year genocidal aggression against Ukraine and its threats to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Baltic states, Poland and Finland, but in its support of dictators like Bashar al-Assad, who continues to massacre his own citizens in Syria with impunity with the help of Moscow and Tehran. Russia also operates in favor of dictatorship in the African continent, make business with terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, which it calls legitimate social political forces, and has ruthlessly abandoned the Armenian in the clutches of Baku. Under a false and cheesy colonial narrative, which has sadly led Latin American politicians such as Lula, Evo Morales, Ortega, Maduro, and López Obrador to maintain an embarrassing complicity with Russian crimes in Ukraine, Putin has gained allies in the Latin America that should, given its terrible colonial history, oppose strongly to all genocidal and colonial aggression like the one Russia does in Ukraine. To be honest, the Latin American academia was not prepared to understand, let alone explain, Russian aggression versus Ukraine. In a small study I am doing at some universities here in Chile, in which I interview students, academicians, and review the bibliography available in the libraries of those universities, I detected a lack of reliable information about the post-Soviet space in general and about Ukraine in particular. Without enough academic resources, books, articles, specialists, the Latin American Academy identified with the progressive left and with emphasis on the processes of decolonization and post-colonization, found itself in the paradox of justifying the Russian colonialist aggression against Ukraine. How can we address this crisis of the political imagination of the Latin American academic left? The beginning of the answer lies in the creation of permanent academic links between Latin America and academia of the post-Soviet countries, including, of course, Ukraine. The Latin American decolonial vision must shake off the dominant Russocentrism and learn to look and understand other non-Russian nations with empathy and solidarity. Both empathy and solidarity depend on the renewal of Latin American academic and political imagination. The politicians will not take the first step. That first step should be given by the academy committed to a modern left thinking and free of the serious flaw inherited from the nostalgia of the USSR period and who remain dominant in our university. An example that this academic collaboration is possible and fruitful was the publication of two academic books that, together with the Ukrainian professor Olena Palko, we published in this year. The first book, as you see in the presentation, in Spanish, the first academic book in Spanish exclusively dedicated to Ukraine, was Discovering Ukraine, Its People, Its History, and Its Culture. Ukrainian specialists from all over the world participated in the book, including 3 Ukrainians who reside in Mexico and Argentina. The second one, published in English in July, Ukraine's Many Faces, I have to say that both books are open access. You can find it for free. Another concrete proposal I would like to put forward in this panel is the creation of a series of university chairs of Eastern and Central Europe, inspired by the model of the Jean Monnet chairs of the European Union. I had the opportunity to coordinate one of the Jean Monnet chairs in Mexico, and it seemed to me that this is an efficient, affordable, and effective way to activate the academic imagination of Latin American students and academics about this region of the world that still suffers the aggression of Russian colonialism. If any of those who hear these words are interested in dwelling and support this proposal of university chairs on Eastern Europe in Latin America, do not hesitate to contact me. Masha can share my WhatsApp and email without problem. I can only say thank you for this opportunity and invite you to contact me and other Latin American academicians and students who believe that we have an unavoidable professional responsibility in the face of the onslaught of colonialism, imperialism, and intolerance of forces that seek to eliminate the freedom of the democratic nation and people. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Masha.
Thank you so much, Manuel, and thank you for giving us this Latin American broad perspective and also Mexican perspective. And thanks for kind of highlighting what happens when there is this epistemic injustice that we call when there is a real lack of knowledge about one context, and it's been very successfully exploited by the countries such as Russia to impose its own narratives and exploit this ignorance to promote its own version and
Excuse me, may I say
that.
one phrase? El pueblo unido.
Jamás será vencido. The people together will be never defeated.
Thank
Pueblo
you.
unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido. This is from my youth.
All right, thank you so much. And we have our next speaker, Leila Al-Shami. Leila is a British Syrian activist and writer. Do we have Leila with us? Yay! Welcome. Leila is a British Syrian activist and writer. She has 2 decades experience working on human rights and social justice issues in Syria and the broader Middle East through grassroots organizing and work with local and international NGOs. She is also a co-author of an amazing book that I highly recommend to everyone. It's called Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I'm unable to be with you in person today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Western left's response to the ongoing conflict in Syria, a conflict which started as a pro-democracy movement against the Assad dictatorship, a peaceful movement against the Assad dictatorship. So I want to go back to April 2018. Because at that time, we saw protests across the Western world that brought together people from both the far left and the far right of the political spectrum, opposing the war on Syria. But this war that people were mobilizing about was not the genocidal war that Assad had been waging for years against the Syrian population. It was against Western limited military action, against the military capabilities of the regime, which had just carried out a chemical attack and massacre in the Damascus suburbs. So this led Syrians to ask why people on the left, who self-identified as anti-imperialists, would be so ready to mobilize to thwart military action by Western states against Assad's military capabilities and chemical weapons manufacturing facilities, but never once mobilized to oppose the war that Assad was conducting along with his allies against the Syrian population. Since then, we've seen the same scenario play out in multiple different contexts, from Hong Kong to Ukraine, which leads me to think that this isn't an aberration, but is instead a key feature of the discourse and practice of today's anti-imperialist left. So working within these kind of outdated and reductionist binaries stemming from the Cold War, the anti-imperialist left divides the world into two competing belligerent blocs. There's the imperialist camp, which is represented by the US, by Israel, by the EU, and their allies, and there's the anti-imperialist camp represented by Russia, China, Iran, and others. The latter camp, the anti-imperialist camp, is always supported regardless of the authoritarian nature of their regimes or the extent of human rights abuses that they are carrying out. And the imperialist camp is always opposed. So we see that the anti-imperialist left is kind of rejecting class struggle or social conflict occurring within countries, and instead seeing world events solely through a geopolitical lens, which means that the authoritarian left is willing to support one state over another in an inter-imperialist conflict, whether that's real or imagined. So this is not a position for revolutionary social transformation. It's more a slide towards multipolarism advocated by certain fascists who see Western power or hegemony as best challenged by the emergence of other global axes of power. Abandoning international solidarity, they completely erase any voices from the ground, and ordinary people are denied any agency. There's no attempt made to understand local context, culture, politics, economy. It's a situation where people living in the imperial core are setting the narrative for the broader globe, and Syria or Ukraine is just a battleground upon which pseudo-anti-imperialists can project their own ideology and political struggles. Failing to respond to any imperialism which is non-Western in origin, this left has been completely impotent to respond to Russian and Iranian imperialism, which are the main threats to Syrian self-determination. Russia and Iran have given the Assad regime significant political and military support. They both intervened militarily in Syria to prop up the Assad regime when it was close to collapse and to help crush the domestic opposition. They've both been rewarded for that support by the regime. Russia has many lucrative contracts now for gas and oil extraction, and Iran is buying up Syria's real estate and repopulating certain areas of Syria with the families of Shia militia, and they're now taking over the land and homes of the communities which were forcibly displaced by the regime and by Iran. So this is on democratic lines because most of those communities were Sunni Muslims, and the regime is trying to ensure that it has a loyal constituency and to ensure that refugees can never return home. When Western states did military intervene in Syria, it wasn't to depose Assad, but was in the context of the war on terror. The coalition completely destroyed the city of Raqqa, which was ISIS's de facto capital in Syria, completely destroyed the city, caused many civilian deaths. But the West didn't mobilize, the Western left didn't mobilize against this. There were no calls for proportionality or to protect civilians, ensure that civilians were protected from bombing and harm. These pseudo-imperialists have also played a very key role in spreading disinformation and false news around the Syria crisis in a way which discredits the opposition and lends support to the Russian and regime narrative. And we see this also very clearly with Ukraine. They argued in the Syria context that all opposition to Assad were extremists, jihadi terrorists. They argued that the opposition were just agents of the West who were trying to advocate for Western military intervention. They claimed that massacres were staged or didn't happen, and that the victims of massacres were just crisis actors. So finally, I just want to say that we should be very clear that these positions are not anti-war positions, because it wasn't just a matter of the Western left opposing military action in Syria. They also ended up opposing any other non-military measures that could have helped the Syrian opposition. For example, calling for the regime to be held accountable, either through sanctions or through legal means for accountability for war crimes. They rejected calls for no-fly zones, which could have protected civilians from aerial assault. So they took no actions at all, even principles which you think are kind of non-negotiable, like releasing democratic protesters who are in Syrian prisons. Even calls like that they failed to support. So I'm going to end there, but I'm just going to go back to what's already been said, that, you know, we need to start approaching struggles or conflict on the basis of common principles. We can't fall into this trap where people only supporting or opposing a cause depending on who is the perpetrator and who is the victim and who are the actors within that who support their own cause or their own politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leila. And yes, I think we would all completely agree that that this very kind of campist position of this side or that side, actually kind of this dogmatic position, actually prevents you from just kind of supporting basic human values and ideas. Actually, I'll probably start with this question then, before I move to the to giving the floor to our audience. So, you know, if we think that that it is better, or that it makes a lot of sense to kind of unite on this mutual solidarity in support of the principles that we all want to live in a democratic state, we all want to have free societies. Why do we need left? Why do we need appealing to left? Why do we need their support? Especially considering that in every society, left actually constitutes only a small part of the population of a very particular politically attuned people with a very specific ideology. So why do we need left? this is the question for everyone, so whoever would like to share.
Yeah, I did sort of indicate it in the beginning, but I'll tell you why, coming from my Indian perspective. Leela will stay with us, right, online? See, I just wanted to show you that the left, again, there's a contradiction there. In India, for instance, the left are large parties, which are the most courageous in defending the rights of the most oppressed, as well as going to, anti-fascist movements, very real, on the ground. So you have this situation where there are groups which are, for instance, just before I came here, there were arrests of journalists. Now, these are left-wing journalists whose paper carries the complete, propaganda, Putin and Xi propaganda, when it comes to international issues. It's all there. Except that in India, because that is the common sense anyway, the left's doing it doesn't really make a big difference. They're not saying the right thing makes. But the person, a 76-year-old editor, he's arrested, he's put away in prison on an anti-terror charge for telling the truth about India. So you have a situation where the left is two things. At the same time, they are defending the most awful regimes, and they're also opposing an awful regime. And therefore, I say that we need the left to understand that by supporting Putin, they're doing themselves damage, not themselves, doing the anti-fascist struggle in India damage. So I think what Leela said about consistency and defending principles, not camps, I think that is crucial, because then one realizes that, you're not defending something because of some abstract ideas that you have. You are defending people. You are defending human beings and justice for human beings. That makes it easier, much easier, doesn't it?
If anyone would like to add something?
I would simply like to connect to what was being said about Syria. She talked about Iranian regime's involvement and how the active presence of the IRGC units in Syria, in fact, helped Bashar Assad and stopped the revolution from reaching its aim. I think that one of the elements that should make us, I can't say laugh, cry, is that certain elements in a certain part of the left world, they claim that they are against imperialism, but then when a state like the Iranian regime has a slogan which is from Karbala to Quds, which literally means from Karbala, which is in Iraq, to Jerusalem, and has this policy of expansion in the region, the policy that she was talking about, and meddling in other countries' region. In that case, we see that that part of the left is not taking a stance against that kind of, if we want to call it imperialism. And so it's a double standard. We have seen this double standard many times. And one of the questions I would like to ask is, why hasn't the European Union taken a firm stance against the IRGC? We know that it was actively involved in crimes against humanity in Syria. We know that it's actively involved in this war by sending, we are talking about war crimes, by sending weapons that are killing civilians in Ukraine. We know that it's the major sponsor of terrorism, the Iranian regime in the region. Yet we have so-called activists who are Iranian regime's lobbyists in the West, especially in the USA, who claim to be part of the left wing, and they push this narrative against sanctions in favor of appeasement, against the blacklisting of the IRGC. So I thought it was important to underline this. I just wanted to add this.
Thank you so much. I think we have a few more minutes for the questions from the audience. I see a hand over there. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Mario, and I'm the guy on the right. That is not always right. I just want to thank you for your leadership, for your experience. I just want to say that the same thing happens in the right. I mean, we have people in Spain that they consider themselves from the right. I think that they are not, they are fascist. And fascist is not right, as Leninist is not a leftish. But, and they think that Vladimir Putin is a defender of the family principles and yada yada. And I mean, they are jerks, and I'm just describing them, not defining them. But it's a struggle that we people from the right, conservatives or liberals, must assume. I mean, to call dictators doesn't matter to whom political familiar they depend on and rely on, what they are. Dictators, fascist, communist, Leninist, I mean, and not assume them as part of our political parties. And I just want to ask Manuel in particular, if he thinks that the problem in the academy and South America in particular has to do with these ideology families, or even has some component of financial aid or supply or something a little more darker behind them. And thank you again so much.
Thank you for your question, Manuel.
Yes, of course. As I tried to say in my presentation, the problem is that we are talking in Latin America about about Syria without the Syrians. We are talking about Iran without the Iranians. And now we are talking inside all our universities and in our media about Ukraine without Ukraine. How to start to solve the problem? The problem is an abstract. You can, when you have an abstract about the Syrians and Iranian and Palestinian, Israelis, Ukrainian people, you can make all kind of propaganda above that. But if you have a process of humanization of that people. If we have Iranian professor in our universities, if you have Latin American professor in your universities, Ukrainian professor, if you have books, it's so simple as that. I went to several libraries in very good universities in Chile, and they don't have enough information about Ukraine. It's impossible to make contact and empathy and solidarity, all that beautiful words that all the panelists are talking about, but without knowledge, it's not about information, it's about knowledge. Without knowledge, all the propaganda from Assad, from the Ayatollahs, from Putin, will work in a very good way in our university. So we must do an effort to have here in Latin America voices from Iran, voices from Syria, voices from Ukraine in Latin America, not far away. So we must think a creative way to deal with this lack of empathy and solidarity beyond the beautiful words. We need to make specific processes to put in contact academics from Latin America with academics from Ukraine, from Poland, from Finland, from Syria, from Palestine, but also from Israel, from Turkey, from the Kurdish. So we need to address the issue in a very basic way. We don't have in Latin America enough information about this problem. So it's my humble opinion.
Thank you so much.
May I very briefly add to that? that actually we Ukrainians and Ukrainian universities are open for these contacts. I'm talking about Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, where I'm professor of comparative politics, and that's why I know a little bit, but about everything. So we would be happy definitely to have webinars, to have joint publications. We are ready to provide interviews directly about physical presence. You know, it's more difficult, but at least I know that in mid-December there would be a delegation of Ukrainian civil society in Brazil. So theoretically, that's closer to come to Chile from Brazil. So this is just theoretically, right? And I'm not sure if you spread the list of contacts, but please spread my email.
Yes.
And we would be happy to contact you, as well as everybody who is interested in other countries. So we are building also African studies. We're interested in have partnerships with Southeast Asia, definitely with India, which is not easy sometimes, but yeah, so we are open to these contacts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're running out of time, but I'm very happy that yeah, but we are running out of time. We can continue answering the questions over coffee, over lunch.
I'm really sorry, but I represent Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and it's necessary
I'm
to
sorry,
talk.
we have our
We don't
schedule
have 10
and,
minutes? 10 minutes? Let's vote. Who is in favor of stopping and going out for lunch? Or who is willing to talk for just 10 minutes to get to truth?
Okay. All right. So the question here I see. Sorry.
From civil society.
Okay.
Hello?
Sure.
Yes. Hello, my name is Matej. I think I'm going to ask a question from myself personally, not necessarily from the organization that I represent. Thank you very much, first of all. I think that this panel has been very human. I felt really the human experience coming through, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask a slightly complicated question, right? So there was some comments earlier about young people who feel discouraged in their belief of the democratic system. Then we heard that we all want to live in democratic societies, and as a young person, like I would like to say, yes, we are disappointed. Democracy, this very strong word, very powerful idea, which was supposed to mean rule for the people, by the people, has evolved into voting one day every 4 years. And bringing us back to the beginning of the panel, where our Indian colleague said we should not talk about them, we should talk about us, then the key word of this event for me has been accountability. And what I wanted to ask is, what is the panel's perspective on accountability? Especially, how can we hold the bad guys or the bad people or the bad actors to account if we don't have proper, robust systems to hold our allies accountable? Thank you.
Maybe we can collect a few questions and then let the participant answer. So there is a question over. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
Good afternoon. I'm Monsi Serrano from the Philippines. I'm a journalist. One of the big issues right now, based on my experience, the propaganda, the disinformation being done by both Russia and China. In my humble opinion, I think since we started cooperating already, the Southern people group, we really have to come up with a very good communication strategy, because each region and each country has its own respective audience. Professor, I love your input. Perhaps you could work and share something. How are we going to improve our communication, our news in this respective region? Thank you.
Okay, a few more questions.
Hi, Nick Yurla from Truth Hounds. Thanks again very much for coming here and for bringing this perspective. This is something that we really lacked, especially talking about this global left, if you can call it. And Kavita, thanks to you personally for sharing your experience as well. One challenge that we have, and I see, is finding the right platform to engage with the thinkers of the global left. I remember going as far as to the left subreddits, and you only can imagine what I was unleashed upon there when I was trying to explain that this is not, Ukrainians are not neo-Nazis, even if somebody wears a chevron, a patch with a wolf's angle, that Ukrainians are fighting the war for survival against the genocidal aggression, that Ukrainians were a part of the Soviet Union. And during this, Ukrainian diplomats, which were Soviet diplomats at the time, fought against apartheid, for example, in South Africa. And now we hear that Russians who were against decolonization during Soviet times monopolize the legacy of the positive things the Soviet Union did for your people. My question is, which platforms are we missing to deliver this message? Because we want this open talk, we want this open engagement. Thank you.
All right, and last question.
Моє запитання, на жаль, не стосується лівого.
Unfortunately, my question will not be associated with either left or right. I would like to deliver to the honorary esteemed audience the idea that I personally, as well as my organization, has the idea to stop military actions, but not in the sense of the war, but rather in the sense of stopping the infliction of death in any kind of conflict, not necessarily the war and warfare. But whether or not such process could be enabled, and if so, then how? My name is Holubko Andrei Alexandrovich, so is there. I represent the International Society for Human Rights. So this is the question which never had a clear answer produced so far. So please contribute to finding such answer. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go very briefly and answer. Oh, okay. One more question.
Given Professor Harany has mentioned Commons Journal, so I have to speak. So, Denis Pilash, I wanted to pick up with this point that the problem with those on the left who have abandoned the solidarity of the oppressed, who have abandoned the solidarity of working people in favor for this geopolitical nonsense, campist way of thinking that enemy of my enemy is my friend, is also often coincides with these are precisely those people who don't bother to speak to actual people on the ground, to actual people in Syria, in Ukraine, in other places. But at the other hand, there are lots of people from across the left spectrum and organizations who did real solidarity, and we experienced it. So maybe those on this really internationalist left, what forms of networks of solidarity can we do to really make these voices significant and not those ones fake anti-imperialists?
Okay, thank you so much. You have another question? Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you for giving me this small opportunity. I just wanted to reflect on what my predecessor said, that perhaps we don't have time, but maybe next time we talk of the new left. There is an emerging new left movement all over the world. It is expressed through different ways, through grassroots. In Europe, it has this green movement, the other perspectives. So they are termed, political science terms them as center, but they are really center-left. So maybe that is one answer, and they are quite having big solidarity with Ukraine. But my question to the panelists is that the dogmatism of the left, in India especially, the very big dogmatism, I need not reflect, and the bifurcation into several parties starting from 1964, which led to multiple left parties in India, which is one of the factors, and they're very, very, very dogmatic about several ideas. And to Professor Haran is that, do we need a very healthy Ukrainian left in order to balance the political spectrum? Thank you. Do we need a healthy political left party to have the, political spectrum balanced?
So let's have just a very, very brief responses, please. Sure, just one by one, very quick.
I'm not going to respond to everything, just to the question you asked. And I do think that there is a need, and no such platform exists now. Again, I say that this need not and must not be a left platform, because as we can see, those labels are not things that really describe everyone here. I think, and that's literally a one-line suggestion that I have on this entire conference, in fact, that you see, we are here to figure out how to create solidarity for Ukraine in the global south. Do you know who are the leaders who are presenting themselves as the leaders of the global south? Narendra Modi of India, as well as Vladimir Putin of Russia. And the latest instance which is allowing them to do this is their loud, Putin is doing this loud, propaganda for, Palestine, but actually Hamas. He is doing it. And Modi is doing it by saying, we are a country just like Israel facing Muslim terrorism next door. These languages, different, but they are trying to usurp the space that we people should have. And I therefore beg that if, the most effective way, the one solid way we could build solidarity for Ukraine at this moment, like today, now, would be for a statement calling for international rule of law to prevail in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, and just say rule of law, which means you cannot kill civilians, you cannot abduct children, you cannot kill civilians, you can't, cut off electricity, water, all of that. That would be a huge gesture. And that's not something a government will do and diplomats will do, but people can. And if we leave alone the ifs and buts and the history, of all the speakers here, look at the social media pages of those of us who've defended Ukraine and are on this panel. Our social media pages now are full of the pain of Palestine and the Gazan people awaiting ethnic cleansing. Look at Leela's, look at mine, So please, do that as well, because otherwise it's very distressing to see that exactly the same blind spots we see on the left, we also see on those who don't count themselves on the left and count themselves on the side of justice.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to add something very briefly?
There were questions to me. So first of all, how to improve communication? Well, if I were right, I would say this is $1 billion question. If I'm left, I cannot talk about money. But look, definitely more knowledge in your countries about Ukraine. And here we need to be inventive, because some things are working in one country, they will not work in other countries. So for example, look, in South Africa, it's so difficult to talk to the ruling party. Okay, because in other countries we talked to ruling parties, to opposition, but South Africa was very difficult. But there is civil society, there are universities, and there are experts, think tanks, so, and it's possible to deal with. So in other countries, definitely, in Muslim countries, definitely, we need to send, to include in the delegations Crimean Tatars. Somebody said it during previous panel. Definitely, yes. We need also to send religious figures, and not only Islam, but also Christian. You know, Archbishop of Cape Town was in Ukraine last winter, actually, in Lviv and Kiev, and he was so vocal about Ukraine, and he's so interested. He boarded 4 a.m. flight in Cape Town to visit our delegation in Pretoria. 4 a.m. flight, you know. So he was so committed. So different methods in different countries. What is demanded from us Ukrainians? It's for us to understand the local context, because it's really difficult to understand if you don't feel it. And I remember after the full-scale invasion, I was so naive that I expected that in all these countries all over the world there would be mass demonstrations, like the left demonstrated against the war in Vietnam and so on and so on. It happened in Europe, but it didn't happen in the global south. So we need, only after visiting these countries, I understood to what extent anti-Westernism is coming with a mother's, you know, milk. And it's very, very difficult to overcome. So we need to be prepared as well, and not to be frustrated. Also about political party of the left in Ukraine. Look, I think it's really important for the foreign audience to understand that Ukrainian nationalism traditionally was left. Okay? The socialist parties dominated in Ukrainian nationalist movement. And this is a paradox of history. That's Lenin, who was left, sent the Red Army to crush the socialist government in independent Ukraine. What happened next? There was a very strong branch of Ukrainian national communism, which combines the idea of communism with independent Soviet Ukrainian Republic. And all these people were demolished in the 30s. And that's why, you know, the fate of creating real Ukrainian left became a problem. I'm finishing. There was a party in Ukraine, which was a socialist party, which evolved to the left social democracy and was about to join the Socialist International. And unfortunately,
Alexei,
they had, let me finish two phrases, sorry, I am left, so I'm against discrimination. So, I'm kidding, forgive me. You interrupted me. So, the socialists actually got the golden share in Ukrainian parliament, and they were simply bought by the oligarchs. And the idea was totally crushed. So yes, I fully agree. We need Ukrainian left party, but it's for Ukrainian left to create it. Maybe some people from Commons, they would be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We only have a minute left, and I would like to give the other speakers an opportunity to respond. Just one sentence. Samira, if you would like to.
Just one sentence, talking about countries who are not in solidarity with Ukraine. I would like to underline, as an Iranian activist in exile, and as someone who works with the National Council of Resistance of Iran, that the Iranian people and the Iranian regime are two very different entities. I think that the uprising, the massive uprising of the last year against the regime showed it. So the Iranian people stand with Ukraine because they do know what it means, even if it's a different context. They do know what dictators do, and the Iranian resistance stands with you. So I just wanted to underline very shortly this point. And I am sure that this is the case also of many other countries which are not democratic countries.
Thank you so much. I think we're really running out of time, and I just want to thank everyone, the panelists, the audience, for coming and for staying so long, even beyond what we were all supposed to stay. Thank you for your interest, and have a great day.
And many thanks to our moderator. We feel it was very, very difficult to moderate this session because of some speakers, but you did it well. Thank you.